So, DG Cameron here, and the question is, can electroconvulsive therapy or shock treatment be banned? Well, the answer to the question is yes. The answer is yes. There is a very good legal argument we can make with the FDA, and it can be made in court as well, and that is that these are no longer ECT devices. This is what my research shows. If these are not ECT devices, then we have a labeling problem. If a machine is mislabeled and it causes a problem for individuals, then it is subject to being banned. So I'm going to make that argument for you today based on research that is in my 2 volumes, The Great Electroconvulsive Therapy Hoax, Volumes 1 and Volumes 2. Well, you have to know a little something about the history of electroshock, particularly modern devices. Between 1976 and 1982, there was an investigation by the FDA of electroconvulsive therapy. Congress had authorized the FDA for the first time to scrutinize medical devices. The only devices at that time were these sine wave devices, these incredibly archaic devices, believe it or not, of which are still in use today. One of the companies, Medcraft, still makes the B24 sine wave, and it has never been banned. This is an upside down machine in that it is capable of giving more output to the youngest age categories than the oldest age categories. And what you have to understand is the younger the person, the less resistance they have to electricity. So this is completely counterintuitive, and these machines should have been banned years ago. When suddenly manufacturers found that the FDA was going to scrutinize their devices for the first time in history, they started creating a new and improved device. Let me introduce you to Richard Weiner. This is Richard Weiner. He is a psychiatrist / electrical engineer. He works at Duke University, and he is the one who has created all the standards for ECT. So, when manufacturers were to come before the FDA, Richard Weiner became the only spokesperson for all the manufacturers in the United States. None of the manufacturers showed up, only Richard Weiner showed up. The FDA had hired an independent test laboratory called Utah Biological Medical Test Laboratory. They were supposed to completely investigate ECT and the history of ECT, which they did. They came up with a finding that only the least amount of electricity to induce a so-called adequate seizure would make this ECT device with even a modicum of safety. That is, that they identified all the morbidity, all the memory loss, all the brain damage as a result of electricity over and above that required to induce an adequate seizure. So what is an adequate seizure? An adequate seizure is defined as a grand mal seizure of 25 seconds or more in length. So the Utah Biological Test Laboratory came up with a definition of ECT, and they basically said that there is only one clinical application for these devices, and that is to produce a grand mal convulsion in a patient with a mental illness. That means that any machine with an excess amount of electricity is not an ECT device. Any device that utilizes more electricity than that required to induce an adequate seizure, this is based on convulsion theory, is unacceptable in the eyes of the Utah Biological Test Laboratory and thus the FDA. Having relayed this information to Richard Weiner so that he could relay it back to the manufacturers, Richard Weiner himself came up with a standard that they more or less promised to adhere to in order for the ECT device to continue on. Keep in mind that ECT had a very bad reputation by this time, that millions of individuals had complained of long-term memory loss, even though they couldn't categorically prove brain damage at that particular time. They have now, if you've seen my last video, they have now proved that there's brain damage every single time with the ECT. But Utah Biological Test Laboratory said that a standard could be written as long as it regulated the devices to the most minimal amount of electricity possible. In accordance with what the APA wanted to do to please the FDA to get by this period of investigation, Richard Weiner came up with the American Psychiatric Association standard, the 1982 APA standard. And in this standard, he identifies 100 joules as the minimum amount of electricity required to induce a seizure in all recipients. He therefore wrote a standard and submitted it to the FDA. He did not ask them to adopt it. He managed to delay adoption of the standard. But by the same token, he said that they would follow something along these lines. Was to make a long story very short and try not to get it too much into the weeds here. The standard required that no output, no machine be able to emit more than 110 joules. 110 joules, you can see, is just over 100 joules, so it's just over minimal stimulus. The idea was to create a device and to regulate devices so that they induced the minimum amount of electricity possible in order to induce an adequate seizure. So if we take 110 joules and divide it by the 100 joule minimal stimulus output for all recipients, you get a 1.1, what I call, this is a long name, multifold threshold titration level output intensity, MTT-LOI for short. That means 1.1 times threshold. And because this has to be consistent, it is 1.1 times threshold for each and every age category. Now you have to understand that each age category has a different threshold output. I sometimes call these threshold outputs, to create a little bit more confusion, relative constants, because the manufacturers use these as constants. And these constants are right here. We can see that the 10-year-old child can have an adequate seizure with only 1 joule. So he or she has the least resistance to electricity. It is the 100-year-old adult that has the most resistance to electricity, so that you have to, according to the manufacturers at least, you have to utilize 100 joules to be able to assure an induction of an adequate seizure in even the most seizure recalcitrant adult. But the 100-year-old male or the 100-year-old adult has the most resistance to electricity, so 100 joules is the minimum amount of electricity required to induce all people in that age category. So you can see that 110 joules is the limit. So a 1.1 fold threshold is what is the limit for all these individuals. So if we're going to do a 1.1 times threshold for the 10-year-old child, it would come out to be 1.1 joules. That would be the maximum amount of output you could use according to this APA standard. A 20-year-old can have a seizure at 4 joules. So they have a little bit more resistance to electricity, but not as much as, say, the 100-year-old. So 4 joules times 1.1, and we have 4.4 joules. 4 joules times 1.1 is 4.4 joules. So that's the maximum amount of output that is allowed by the American Psychiatric Association standard. You may not be familiar with the term joules. It is a measure of, in this case, electrical output, electrical energy output. And if you take 1 joule and divide it by 1 second, that becomes a watt. So a 10-watt bulb, for instance, emits 10 joules every second. A 50-watt light bulb emits 50 joules every second, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what you're looking at right here is the safest these machines can be made. You can't make them any safer than this. 110 joules is allowed for a 100-year-old adult, and so it's a 1.1 times threshold, or 1.1 multifold threshold titration level output intensity. That is the most that is allowed from the APA standard. So Richard Weiner, in essence, promised the FDA that he would use these new machines called brief pulse machines because they could induce seizure at a lot less output than the sine wave device. You can see these are Weiner's charts that he submitted to the FDA. They're part of the 1982 APA standard. You can see down here, this is a brief pulse device, and it utilizes a maximum of 100 joules to induce seizure in all recipients. Now you compare that to the previous device, which was the sine wave device, and you can see that it used up to 200 joules according to Richard Weiner. So the sine wave device had to use twice the output to induce a seizure as did the more efficient brief pulse device. And so all devices from this point on were going to be brief pulse devices, and indeed they pretty much were, except that sine wave never got banned. So here are the parameters of the first machine that was introduced to the FDA during this 1976 to 1982 investigation. And it was called the Ect C, and indeed it was an ECT device because it used the most minimal amount of electricity possible. Instead of a 1.1 times threshold output for each age category, it used a 1.08, a little less than 1.1. So for the 10-year-old child who seizes, all members of the 10-year-old category can seize with 1 joule. So it was limited to 1.08 joules on the Ect C. All these others are similar. 16 joules for the 40-year-old times 1.08, 17.28 joules was the maximum that the Ect C used. And this was used as a sort of archetype to get by the FDA. Now, if you want to see just how much output this is, we can convert these to watts. All you do is divide the amount of energy output by the number of. So if you really want to see the Ect C device, it's still in the abstract, but this is a chart of the Ect C. And these are the charges, and this is the resistance. It's not going to mean a lot to you unless you're an electrical engineer. But for the 10-year-old child, this is a default output of a little over 1 joule, 1.08 joules, for a period of time of 0.703 seconds. So the maximum amount is given to the 100-year-old individual, and he or she gets 108 joules over a 2-second period. So what does that mean? That means that the 10-year-old child gets enough power to light up a 1.54 watt light bulb for 0.703 seconds. Now that's minimal stimulus for the 10-year-old child. Whereas for the 100-year-old, we take that 108 joules divided by the duration that it's administered to him. You get 54 watts. So it's the same amount of power that would be required to light up a 54 watt light bulb for 2 full seconds. That's minimal stimulus, and it seems dangerous enough, does it not? But that's as safe as you can make these devices. Well, not quite. This is for bilateral ECT. When you put the electrodes on both sides of the temple, that is bilateral ECT. You can reduce the amount of electricity required with a unilateral ECT, putting it on just one side of the temple. But the thing is, they don't use UL ECT. They only use bilateral ECT. So this is as safe as you can make the machine using bilateral ECT. Now, I got to tell you, as bad as that sounds, the sine wave device was much worse. And not anybody knows this, I don't think. I mean, until I discovered it in my own research. The 200 joules that sine wave is capable of putting out is all done in the 10-year-old age category. That's because these are constant voltage devices and the amperage deteriorates. So they start out with the capability of using the most electricity in the youngest age category, and as the amperage deteriorates, they can only utilize so much electricity for, let's say, the older the recipient. So it's what I call an upside down machine. It's a very dangerous device for people who are young, 10 to 30-year-old age category. This machine should have been banned, but never was, and is still in use today. So you can compare that, for instance, to 200 joules, which in a sine wave, according to my calculations, is about 23 times threshold, because sine wave requires more output to reach threshold. So this is compared to the brief pulse device, which only puts at 1.1 joule, according to the APA standard, in with the 10-year-old child. So brief pulse was a lot better, and so this is what the FDA said. Okay, we'll let you have these machines as long as you follow some facsimile of the 1982 APA standard. Okay, the problem is, as soon as the investigation was over, which lasted from 1976 to 1982, of course manufacturers started producing their own devices, which were a lot more powerful than the ones that they promised. Here's the Ect C, which they they promised to do something like this. You can see it has a 1.08 threshold output for every single age category, and these are the outputs. So about 1983, they began producing devices. When look at the threshold output now, it's gone from a 1.08 or a 1.1 to 2.52 times threshold for every age category. Instead of putting out 1.1 joules for the 10-year-old child, they're now putting out 2.52 joules. That may not sound like much, but keep in mind it only takes 1 joule to seize a 10-year-old child. So this is 2.5 times threshold, 2.5 times that required to induce a so-called adequate seizure, and 2.52 times the threshold output of a 100-year-old. Now they're using 252 joules on the 100-year-old. Instead of 110 or 108 joules, they're now up to 252 joules. And what does this mean? So they've gone from, let's say for the 100-year-old, emitting enough energy to light up a 54-watt light bulb for 2 seconds, which was bad enough, to now a 63-watt light bulb for 4 seconds. That's the second generation device that I discovered. And yet these manufacturers hid this amount, and they never really properly reported it to the FDA. They hid these outputs, believe it or not, by using average impedances. Now again, that may not make a lot of sense to you, but if you use these formulas and you put in the average resistance, which is the average is, they say, is 220 ohms, instead of putting in the actual maximum resistance, which for a 100-year-old was something like 555 ohms, they just put in 220 ohms, and it came out, the machine readouts came out around 100 joules, seemingly in accordance with the American Psychiatric Association standard, but in fact it had really surpassed the standard 2.5 times. Now I'm going really fast here, but in 1995 they come up with a third generation device. They have now basically doubled the output of the second generation device. So now for the 10-year-old child who seizes at 1 joule, they're administering a default output of about 4.5 joules or more. And for the 100-year-old, it's now about 452 joules instead of that 110 joule maximum the APA standard promised. If you want to know a little bit more about the history of it, there were standards in Europe as well, because Medcraft, Mecta, and Somatics, the three manufacturers, well, not Medcraft so much, but Mecta and Somatics wanted to market their devices on a worldwide basis. So in Europe, and there was a different standard in Europe, and so this was called the International Electrotechnical Commission standard, but it was also written by Richard Weiner. And that one is also very deceptive. But when FDA in 1995 wanted to adopt all the standards of the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission standards for all medical devices, Weiner and company objected. They did not want to adopt the IEC standard, even though it in essence allowed second generation devices. They were not satisfied. They were already marketing third generation devices, which had doubled second generation devices. So the International Electrotechnical Commission, they would not go along with this. And so Richard Weiner next requested that they just withdraw the standard altogether, which is what they did. So there was no standard that, even though the IEC standards were adopted by the FDA, no standard regulates ECT. In fact, Richard Weiner had submitted a new standard which was rejected by the International Electrotechnical Commission, and that's the one that manufacturers go by, even though the IEC refused to adopt it. It allows third generation devices, and in fact it allows fourth and fifth generation devices, which may or may not be marketed now. But the third generation device, it is being marketed. There was a recent lawsuit with the third generation Somatics device, the System 4, that was I think it was settled in favor of the plaintiff. It had obviously brain damaged him. But if you want to look at what's happening with third generation devices, remember the 10-year-old child was getting enough power to light up a 1.53 watt light bulb for 0.7 seconds with the first generation device, which was an ECT device. Second generation device, 2.7 watt light bulb for almost 1 second. Third generation device, 3.5 watt light bulb for about 1.24 seconds. The 100-year-old started out with a 54 watt light bulb for 2 seconds. Second generation 63 watt light bulb for 4 seconds. Now we're up to an 85 watt light bulb for 5.32 seconds. Now what I'm telling you is not speculation. This is a fact. But these figures that I'm giving you now have never been seen by the American public. Fourth generation device, which I don't know if it's made or not made, but legal under the Weiner de facto standard, puts out 9 times threshold. So that now you're giving the 10-year-old child 9 joules, and you're giving the 100-year-old 904 joules. Fourth generation device. Fifth generation device is also legal under the Weiner standard, which I prove in my two volumes. The Great Electroconvulsive Therapy Hoax, volumes 1 and 2 in Amazon Books. But you can see that it's 12 times threshold. It's actually legal under the Weiner de facto standard. Whether it's ever been made or not, I can't tell you. But I can tell you that first, second, and third generation devices are being marketed, particularly third generation devices right now are being marketed. And this is what is being given to people instead of ECT. A fifth generation device, if such a thing was actually made, would now emit a 30 watt light bulb for half a second for the 10-year-old child and a 300 watt light bulb for 4 seconds for the 100-year-old recipient. Okay, so we were creating a chart of first through fifth generation devices. This is something like what it would look like. This is the green line represents threshold. This is for brief pulse devices. The blue one represents the first generation device. It's just above threshold. Device is in yellow. It's a 2.5 times threshold. Third generation device, about 4.5 times threshold. It's represented in gray. And then these fourth and fifth generation devices are up here, about 10 and 12 times threshold. So if we look at it like this, because these outputs with these brief pulse devices, which was originally a good thing, use gradational outputs or gradient outputs because, remember, the 10-year-old has much less resistance to electricity than the 100-year-old. So it looks something like this. This is what it actually looks in joules. This up here is threshold output, the number of times threshold, so they're just sort of flat lines. But here, if you actually do the energy output in joules, it looks something like this. You can see that it has increased dramatically over 5 generations. So if we now compare sine wave to the 5 generations of brief pulse devices, this black line here represents sine wave. And you can see that brief pulse has now surpassed sine wave, certainly in cumulative output, even from the second generation device, which put out about 250 joules compared to the 200 joules of sine wave. Now, sine wave is still a bad instrument because it emits its 200 joules in the 10-year-old age category. You can still see here that even though brief pulse has now surpassed sine wave in cumulative output, sine wave is still more devastating in the 10, 20, and 30-year-old age categories. Fifth generation device is as dangerous in the 30-year-old age category, but not until 30 years old. So in these younger age categories, sine wave is still an extremely dangerous device and should be gotten rid of. But the point is, you can see that all these other devices are no longer ECT devices. What they actually are what I call ENR devices. They're adequate electricity devices. They are no longer based on an adequate convulsion. They are based on adequate amounts of electricity. This is an entirely different procedure than the one defined by the Utah Biological Test Laboratory in about 1978. Remember, Utah said that the only function of an ECT device was to induce an adequate convulsion. It's therefore not supposed to have any more electricity than is required to induce that adequate convulsion. Only the Mecta-C device was an ECT device. All the rest of them are adequate electricity devices. That is something entirely different. Electricity devices are what I call electroneuron reduction devices. They're made to reduce the number of neurons in your brain, especially in the left lateral prefrontal cortex. If you don't believe me, go back to the first video and look at the parent study, which proved brain damage in every single individual. And this was done with a second generation device, not a third generation device, which is twice as powerful as the second generation device. Moreover, there's no informed consent. People are not being informed. If you mislabel this as ECT, you are suggesting that it has the minimal amount of electricity required to induce an adequate convulsion. Instead, these devices are based on adequate electricity, and they do not work unless they have an adequate amount of electricity, adequate enough to destroy neurons in the brain. That's how the device works. This is the statute under the FDA. It says the FDA has the authority to ban a medical device intended for use if it finds, on the basis of all available data and information, that the device presents a substantial deception to patients or users about the benefits of the device, or an unreasonable and substantial risk of illness or injury which cannot be corrected by a change in the labeling. Under Title 21, Chapter 1, Subchapter H, Part 895, Banned Devices, it says the Commissioner may initiate a proceeding to make a device a banned device whenever the Commissioner finds, on the basis of all available data and information, that the device presents a substantial deception or an unreasonable and substantial risk of illness or injury that the Commissioner determines cannot be or has not been corrected or eliminated by labeling, or by a change in labeling, or by a change in advertising if the device is a restricted device. The reason you cannot fix this by labeling is we require that we identify the device correctly, is that an ENR device is an adequate electricity device. It is not an ECT device. And according to Utah Biological Test Laboratory, the danger was all about too much electricity. These machines are now designed to emit too much electricity because they have to injure the brain in order for the procedure to work. In any case, they are not ECT devices, and by saying that they're ECT devices, you are implying to the recipient, to the patient, to the person who takes this, that you're using the least amount of electricity possible, when that is just absolutely not true. I submitted both my books to the FDA, and I submitted a lot of other information. So I'm asking that they ban these devices based on the fact that they're mislabeled, and that creates a danger to anybody taking them, believing that this is ECT instead of an ENR device based on adequate electricity. All right, so if you would like to ban ECT, I have sent my letter and I've sent my books into the FDA, and I have complained and I have requested that they ban these devices. If you would like to join me in this, I'm going to go ahead and read this. If you would like to, like the FDA to ban ECT, feel free to copy the letter below. I created a short letter for all of you. Sign your name and email it to this address right here, cdrh device allegations at fda.hhs.gov. If you want to CC me, I'll keep you informed about the progress that's being made. So here's the letter. I'll read it. It says, "To whom it may concern, please feel free to copy this and send it by email it to the FDA. In accordance with FDA Title 21, Chapter 1, Subchapter H, Section 895.21, and Section 502 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for medical devices, I am calling for the banning of all current electroconvulsive therapy devices manufactured by American manufacturers, Medcraft, Mecta, and Somatics, as well as foreign ECT devices used in this country, due to mislabeling, which results in lack of informed consent and subsequent physical harm to recipients. The Utah Medical Biological Laboratory, employed by FDA between 1976 and 1982 to investigate ECT, clearly define the ECT device in this manner. There is only one clinical application for these devices, and that is to produce a grand mal convulsion in a patient with a mental illness. All currently used devices labeled as electroconvulsive therapy or ECT devices, including sine wave, are in fact no longer electroconvulsive therapy devices, as they are no longer based on adequate seizure alone, but on adequate amounts of electricity. ECT implies the least amount of electricity possible to induce a so-called adequate seizure. Modern devices use much more electricity than is required to induce an adequate seizure, so that electricity has become the treatment. This violates informed consent. As such, adequate electricity devices, which Cameron labels ENR, electroneuron reduction devices, are brain damaging. This was proved by the 2012 Perrin study. Please halt the use of all modern-day adequate electricity devices and force them to go through FDA pre-market approval. So I should tell you that they come up with reasons for increasing the power of the machines, although they never tell anybody how, to the degree that they have increased the power, and it doesn't cover at all third generation devices, but we'll discuss that the next time, and we'll discuss the deception that they use and the falsehoods that they use to justify increasing these outputs, even though they don't tell anybody how much electricity they're actually using. But they don't want you to know that. They've covered that up, and for that reason, that's also fraud. So please, if you want to ban ECT, join me in copying this letter and sending it to this particular email address. And if you want, you can email me too, and I'll keep you posted. So this is DG Cameron, and I hope you gain some insight into banning ECT, which we can do.